One for nearly 4 decades, Scott Pelley was not just another face on television. He was one of the voices Americans turned to when the world felt uncertain, when the headlines were terrifying, when the truth seemed buried under politics, fear, and power. He had stood in war zones, questioned presidents, investigated corruption, and carried the weight of national tragedy through a calm, steady voice. To millions of viewers, Scott Pelley represented something rare in modern media. Old-school journalism, the kind built on facts, patience, courage, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. But after 37 years at CBS, the ending came not with applause, not with a tribute, and not with the kind of farewell a legendary correspondent might have deserved. It came with shock, tension, and a silence that only made the story feel darker. Scott Pelley was out. And the question that immediately spread across the media world was simple. How could one of CBS News' most respected journalists be pushed aside after everything he had given to the network? To understand why the firing felt so brutal, you have to understand what Scott Pelley meant to CBS. He was not someone who appeared overnight. He was not a celebrity journalist built by viral moments or social media attention. Pelley came from a different era, an era where reporters spent years earning trust one story at a time. He joined CBS News in the late 1980s and slowly built a reputation as a serious correspondent, someone who did not chase easy drama, but pursued stories with depth and moral weight. He reported from some of the most dangerous places on earth. He covered conflicts, disasters, political scandals, and human tragedies. He interviewed world leaders and ordinary people whose lives have been torn apart by events beyond their control. There was always a certain gravity in his delivery. He did not need to shout. He did not need to perform outrage. His power came from restraint. That restraint became his signature. When Scott Pelley eventually became anchor of the CBS Evening News, he carried with him the image of a journalist who believed the news was more than entertainment. It was a public duty. For viewers who were tired of noise, Pelley seemed like a reminder of what television news used to be: careful, serious, and deeply committed to truth. But inside CBS, things were changing. The television business was no longer the same. Ratings mattered more than ever. Digital competition was growing. Cable news had become louder, faster, and more political. Networks were under pressure to survive in a media world where attention was everything. And in that world, even respected journalists could become vulnerable. Pelley's time as anchor of the CBS Evening News ended in 2017. At the time, it was presented as a major shift, but later, Pelley suggested there was more behind the scenes. He said he had complained about problems inside the news division, including what he described as a hostile work environment. According to Pelley, after he raised concerns, he lost his anchor chair. That claim changed the way many people looked at his departure. It was no longer just a normal network reshuffle. It sounded like a warning sign, a sign that Scott Pelley was willing to challenge powerful people inside his own organization, even if it cost him. But losing the anchor chair did not end his CBS career. Pelley remained a major presence on 60 Minutes, one of the most respected news programs in American television history. For decades, 60 Minutes had been seen as the gold standard of broadcast journalism. It was tough, polished, fearless, and often uncomfortable for the powerful. To be part of that program was to belong to a journalistic institution. And Scott Pelley belonged there. On 60 Minutes, he continued doing the kind of work that made him famous. Serious interviews, investigations, stories that demanded time, preparation, and courage. He was not simply reading headlines from a desk anymore. He was back in the field, doing the work that had defined his career. But by 2026, something inside CBS had shifted again. The network was under new pressures, new leadership, and new expectations. Behind the scenes, tension reportedly began building over the future direction of 60 Minutes. For a program with such a long and proud history, change was always going to be sensitive. But this was not just about style. According to reports and Pelley's own claims, This became a battle over the identity of the program itself. Pelley allegedly believed that the new leadership was changing the DNA of 60 Minutes. That phrase mattered. He was not merely complaining about a producer, a headline, or a single editorial decision. He was suggesting that something fundamental was being threatened, the values, standards, and journalistic independence that had made the show legendary. Then came the confrontation. According to accounts of what happened, Pelley clashed with CBS leadership over editorial direction and the handling of a politically sensitive story. Pelley claimed he was being pressured in ways he believed were not consistent with the standards of 60 Minutes. He reportedly objected strongly, and the disagreement became serious enough that his future at the network was suddenly in danger. For most employees, challenging leadership is risky. For a journalist, it can be career-defining. And for Scott Pelley, who had already spent decades proving his commitment to the craft, the choice seemed almost inevitable. He was not going to quietly accept something he believed was wrong. He had built his entire career around asking hard questions. Now, those hard questions were directed inside his own newsroom. And then, after 37 years, CBS ended its relationship with him. To the public, the phrase, "parted ways," may have sounded clean and corporate. But behind those words was a much harsher reality. A man who had given most of his professional life to CBS was suddenly gone from one of the most iconic news programs in America. No long farewell. No grand send-off. No emotional final broadcast honoring decades of work. Just an abrupt ending that left viewers stunned and colleagues asking what had really happened behind closed doors. The most painful part was not simply that Scott Pelley lost his job. Television, careers, and all the time. Anchors are replaced. Correspondents move on. Networks make changes. But this felt different because of who he was, how long he had served, and what he seemed to be fighting for. To many people, Pelley's firing looked like more than a personnel decision. It looked like a symbol of something bigger. The collision between traditional journalism and a new media age driven by power, politics, pressure, and control. For decades, Scott Pelley had reported on institutions from the outside. He had investigated governments, corporations, and leaders. But in the final chapter of his CBS career, the institution at the center of the story was his own network. And that made the ending even more devastating. What made Scott Pelley's exit so unsettling was not only the fact that he was fired. It was the timing, the silence, and the feeling that something much larger had been happening behind the cameras. For viewers, CBS was supposed to represent stability. It was one of the old pillars of American broadcasting, a network with a long history of respected journalists, legendary interviews, and programs that helped shape the national conversation. But behind the polished image, the newsroom appeared to be going through a painful identity crisis. And Scott Pelley had become one of the most visible symbols of that crisis. For years, 60 Minutes had carried a reputation that few programs in television could match. It was not built on noise. It was not built on cheap outrage. It was built on investigation, confrontation, and credibility. When 60 Minutes knocked on a door, powerful people paid attention. When its correspondents asked questions, executives, politicians, and public figures knew they were not dealing with ordinary television journalism. They were dealing with an institution. That is why the reported conflict over the show's future felt so serious. To outsiders, it may have looked like another internal media dispute. But to someone like Pelley, who had spent his life inside the culture of serious journalism, changes to 60 Minutes were not just business decisions. They were matters of principle. The show's legacy had been shaped by generations of journalists who believed that facts came first, that pressure from powerful people had to be resisted, and that a story should not be softened just because it made someone uncomfortable. For Pelley, that tradition was not nostalgia. It was the foundation of everything the program represented. So when he allegedly warned that the DNA of 60 Minutes was being changed, those words carried years of frustration, fear, and loyalty. He was not simply protecting his own place at the table. He seemed to be defending a journalistic code that he believed was slipping away. But in modern television, loyalty to tradition can become dangerous. Networks are no longer just competing with each other. They are fighting streaming platforms, social media, political pressure, shrinking attention spans, and a public that no longer trusts the media the way it once did. Executives want shows that feel fresh, fast, and relevant. They want ratings. They want younger audiences. They want content that travels beyond the television screen. And sometimes, in that race to survive, the quiet, careful methods of old-school reporting can begin to look outdated to the people in charge. That is where the tragedy of Scott Pelley's situation becomes clearer. He had given CBS exactly what had once made the network proud: seriousness, experience, credibility, and discipline. But the very qualities that made him respected may have also made him difficult in a changing corporate environment. He was not the kind of journalist who could be easily managed if he believed a line had been crossed. He was not someone who would simply adjust his voice to fit a new strategy. He had spent decades earning the authority to say no. And sometimes, in a newsroom under pressure, the person who says no becomes the problem. Reports suggested that the breaking point came after a tense meeting with leadership. The details became the subject of intense media attention, but the emotional center of the story was simple. Pelley believed something was wrong. He said so directly, and CBS decided to move on without him. That ending felt cold because it reduced a long and respected career to a corporate decision. 37 years became a sentence and a statement. Decades of dangerous reporting became a quiet removal. A journalist who had helped define CBS News was suddenly discussed like an obstacle to be cleared away. For viewers who had followed his career, that was difficult to accept. Scott Pelley was not a perfect figure. No journalist is. Every long career includes criticism, controversy, and difficult choices. But what made him different was the consistency of his public image. He came across as someone who took the mission of journalism seriously. He did not behave like a television star chasing personal fame. He seemed more interested in the work than the spotlight. That made his firing feel less like the departure of a celebrity and more like the removal of a witness. A witness to what CBS used to be. That idea is what gave the story its emotional force. Many people did not just see Pelley leaving a job. They saw a chapter of American broadcast journalism closing in real time. His exit raised uncomfortable questions. What happens when legacy news organizations are taken over by people with different instincts? What happens when business strategy collides with editorial independence? What happens when a journalist refuses to bend? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if someone with Scott Pelley's reputation could be pushed out, who inside a newsroom is truly safe? The public may never know every detail of what happened in those private conversations. Newsrooms, like governments and corporations, often protect their internal conflicts behind carefully chosen language. Words like transition, restructure, and parted ways are designed to sound calm. They are designed to avoid emotion. But sometimes those words hide the reality of power. For Pelley, the end of his CBS career seemed to confirm something he had hinted at years earlier, that speaking up inside a powerful institution can carry a devastating cost. In 2017, he lost the anchor chair after raising concerns about the internal environment at CBS News. Years later, after another confrontation, he lost his place at 60 Minutes. The pattern, whether intentional or not, gave the story a painful shape. Again and again, Scott Pelley appeared to find himself at odds with the people running the organization he had served for most of his adult life. That is what made the firing feel brutal. It was not just a professional setback. It was a collision between memory and power. On one side stood a journalist shaped by decades of reporting, tradition, and institutional pride. On the other side stood a network trying to reinvent itself in a volatile media world. Somewhere between those two forces, trust broke apart. And when trust breaks inside a newsroom, the damage does not stay behind closed doors. It reaches the audience. It changes the way viewers look at the stories being told. It makes people wonder who decides what gets reported, what gets softened, what gets buried, and what never makes it to air. For CBS, Scott Pelley's firing was meant to be an ending. But for many viewers, it became the beginning of a much larger question. What exactly was CBS trying to become? The most heartbreaking part of Scott Pelley's story is that he did not leave CBS as an outsider. He was not a stranger criticizing the network from a distance. He was a man who had spent nearly his entire professional life inside its walls. He knew the culture. He knew the standards. He knew the history. And that is exactly why his words carried so much weight. When someone new complains about change, executives can dismiss it as resistance. When a young employee raises concerns, leaders can frame it as inexperience. But when a journalist with 37 years of service says the soul of a legendary program is being damaged, people listen. And CBS had a problem. Scott Pelley was not easy to ignore. He had earned his reputation through years of difficult reporting. He had not built his name by chasing viral clips or playing to one political side. He had built it by showing up, asking questions, and standing in places most people would avoid. That kind of credibility cannot be bought overnight. It cannot be created by a marketing campaign. It comes from time, risk, and consistency. That is why his firing created such a powerful reaction. It felt personal because viewers had grown old with him. They had watched him report through national emergencies, wars, elections, disasters, and moments of grief. His voice had become part of the background of American life. For some, he represented a style of journalism that felt increasingly rare. Calm but firm, serious but human, skeptical but not theatrical. So when CBS cut ties with him, it felt like more than one man losing a position. It felt like a warning about what happens when journalism becomes trapped between corporate power and public trust. Inside every major newsroom, there is always tension. Reporters want time. Executives want results. Producers want clarity. Lawyers want caution. Owners want stability. Advertisers want distance from controversy. Political figures want favorable coverage. And audiences want the truth, even when the truth is complicated. The best journalism exists in the middle of all that pressure. But it only survives when the people doing the work have enough independence to resist being controlled. That was the fear at the center of Pelley's clash. If a program like 60 Minutes could lose its independence, what did that say about the rest of the industry? If one of the most powerful news brands in America could be reshaped behind closed doors, what chance did smaller newsrooms have? If a correspondent with Pelley's stature could be removed after speaking up, what message did that send to younger journalists watching from the sidelines? The message seemed chilling. Challenge the wrong people, and even a legendary career may not protect you. But Pelley's situation also revealed something about the emotional cost of journalism. Viewers often see only the finished product, the clean interview, the edited segment, the confident voiceover, the polished studio lights. They do not see the battles before a story airs. They do not see the arguments over wording, framing, sources, legal risk, corporate pressure, and political backlash. They do not see the moment when a journalist has to decide whether to compromise or push back. For Scott Pelley, that moment appears to have come late in his career when many people might have chosen comfort. He could have stayed quiet. He could have protected his place. He could have adjusted to the new environment and waited out the storm. After all, he had already achieved almost everything a broadcast journalist could achieve. He had the name, the awards, the respect, and the legacy. But instead, he spoke. That decision may have cost him his job, but it also strengthened the story people would tell about him. Because in the end, journalism is not only measured by the stories reporters tell about others. It is also measured by what they are willing to risk when their own institution is involved. And that is where the drama became almost cinematic. For decades, Scott Pelley had reported on powerful systems. He had examined how institutions protect themselves, how leaders avoid responsibility, and how truth can be buried beneath official language. Then, suddenly, he seemed to be living inside one of those stories himself. The network that had given him a platform became the institution he challenged. The newsroom that had shaped his identity became the place where his career came to an abrupt end. There was a painful irony in that. CBS had benefited from Pelley's credibility for decades. His seriousness gave weight to the network's brand. His presence on 60 Minutes helped preserve the image of a program committed to hard journalism. But when he became openly critical of the direction he believed leadership was taking, that same credibility became dangerous. A respected insider can do more damage than any outside critic because he knows what the public does not. That may be why the silence after his firing felt so heavy. In media, silence is rarely empty. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is legal caution. Sometimes it is fear. A network does not always explain the full story because full explanations create more questions. So instead, the public receives carefully shaped statements. The harsh edges are sanded down. The human pain is removed. The final result sounds professional, but it does not feel complete. That gap between the official version and the emotional reality is where suspicion grows. People wanted to know, was Pelley fired because of one confrontation or because he represented an old guard that no longer fit the network's plans? Was the dispute truly about editorial standards or about power? Was CBS trying to modernize 60 Minutes, or was it weakening the very thing that made the show trusted? And most of all, what did Pelley know that made his departure feel so explosive? Those questions may never be fully answered, but they gave the story its staying power. Because audiences understand betrayal. They understand what it feels like to give years of loyalty to a place, only to discover that loyalty does not guarantee protection. They understand the pain of watching values change inside an institution they once believed in. And they understand the fear of speaking up when silence would be safer. That is why Scott Pelley's firing struck such a nerve. It was not only about television. It was about work, power, loyalty, and the cost of integrity. It was about a man nearing the final chapters of his career who seemed unwilling to pretend everything was fine. It was about the brutal realization that even decades of service can be erased when leadership decides a person no longer fits the future. And for CBS, that created a problem no statement could easily fix. Because the more quietly they tried to close the door on Scott Pelley, the louder the question became. What happened behind that door before he was pushed out? To understand why Scott Pelley's departure felt so devastating, you have to look beyond the headlines. A firing can be explained in a few words. A career cannot. And Scott Pelley's career was not simply a list of job titles, broadcasts, and interviews. It was a long public relationship with trust. Trust is the most fragile currency in journalism. It takes years to build and only one moment to destroy. For decades, Pelley had built that trust by doing something that now feels almost old-fashioned. He treated the news as a responsibility, not a performance. He did not need a loud personality to dominate the screen. He did not need to turn every story into a spectacle. His authority came from the belief that facts mattered, that context mattered, and that the journalist's job was not to entertain the powerful, but to question them. That is why his final conflict with CBS carried so much emotional weight. It was not just another internal battle between a correspondent and management. It seemed to touch the oldest question in journalism. Who gets to control the truth before the public sees it? For viewers, 60 Minutes had always represented a certain promise. The promise that someone would take the time to investigate. The promise that powerful people could still be challenged on national television. The promise that, even in a noisy media world, there is still a place for serious reporting. And Scott Pelley was one of the people who made that promise feel real. But promises are difficult to keep when institutions change. Behind every historic newsroom, there are two competing forces. One force is tradition, the memory of what made the institution respected in the first place. The other is survival, the pressure to adapt, to chase audiences, to satisfy executives, and to remain profitable in a brutal media economy. Sometimes those forces can work together, but when they collide, people like Scott Pelley often end up in the middle. He represented the tradition. He represented the old CBS News ideal: sober, disciplined, skeptical, and careful. He came from a world where credibility was not measured by online reaction, but by whether the reporting could stand the test of time. In that world, a journalist's reputation was not built overnight. It was earned slowly, story by story, correction by correction, interview by interview. But the media industry around him had transformed. Speed became more valuable than patience. Personality became more visible than reporting. Conflict became a product. The line between news and commentary blurred in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. And inside that changing environment, a correspondent like Pelley could look both essential and inconvenient. Essential because he carried credibility. Inconvenient because credibility comes with independence. That independence may have been the real danger. A journalist with no power can be ignored. A journalist with no reputation can be replaced quietly. But a journalist like Scott Pelley, with decades of public trust behind him, can turn an internal dispute into a national conversation simply by refusing to stay silent. And that is exactly what made his exit so explosive. When news broke that CBS had ended its relationship with him, many people did not just ask what he had done. They asked what he had refused to do. That difference matters. A firing usually invites suspicion about the employee. But in this case, the suspicion quickly shifted toward the institution. Viewers wondered whether Pelley had crossed a professional line or whether he had refused to cross an ethical one. That uncertainty became the heart of the story. CBS could frame the decision in clean corporate language. But clean language cannot erase messy questions. Why did a journalist of his stature leave so abruptly? Why did the conflict appear to involve the direction of 60 Minutes? Why had Pelley reportedly been so concerned about the show's identity? And why did this feel like the end of something larger than one man's employment? The answer may be that audiences were not only reacting to Pelley, they were reacting to their own anxiety about the news itself. Public trust in media has been under attack for years. People on all sides of politics accuse networks of bias, manipulation, omission, and agenda-driven reporting. In that climate, the image of a respected veteran journalist being pushed out after raising concerns felt like confirmation of a fear many viewers already had, that the public may never see the full battle behind what becomes the news. That is why the story traveled beyond media insiders. It touched something ordinary people understand. Almost everyone knows what it feels like to watch a workplace change around them, to see new leadership arrive with new priorities, to feel that the values that once defined the place are being replaced by colder calculations, to realize that loyalty, experience, and years of service do not always matter when power changes hands. Scott Pelley's situation became a workplace story as much as a media story. A man gave 37 years to one network. He helped strengthen its reputation. He carried its name into dangerous places and difficult interviews. Then, when he challenged the direction of that same institution, he was shown the door. That kind of ending feels brutal because it strips away the illusion that institutions are sentimental. They are not. They remember your value only as long as your value serves their future. For Pelley, the emotional wound was not just professional. It was symbolic. CBS was not merely an employer. It was the platform that shaped his public identity. It was the place where he became a trusted national figure. It was the home of the program that allowed him to do some of his most important work. Losing that place after so many years must have felt like losing a part of himself. And yet, there's another way to look at the ending. Perhaps Scott Pelley's final act at CBS was not defeat. Perhaps it was testimony. By speaking up, by challenging leadership, by refusing to treat 60 Minutes as just another television product, he forced the public to look at something networks would rather keep private: the internal struggle over journalism's future. His firing may have ended his time at CBS, but it also made his concerns impossible to ignore. That is the paradox of powerful institutions. They can remove a person from the building. They can cancel a contract. They can end a broadcast career. But they cannot always control what the removal means. Sometimes the act of pushing someone out only makes people listen more closely to what that person was trying to say. And that is what happened here. Scott Pelley's departure made viewers revisit his past warnings. It made them remember his earlier claims about losing the anchor chair after raising concerns inside CBS News. It made them connect old tensions with new ones. It made them wonder whether this was an isolated event or part of a deeper pattern inside a network struggling with its own identity. The tragedy is that Pelley may never get the ending many viewers believe he deserved. There may be no final, standing ovation on 60 Minutes. No long retrospective of his greatest reports. No emotional goodbye from the studio where he spent so much of his life. His CBS story may end not with celebration, but with conflict. But maybe that is fitting in a painful way. Scott Pelley built his career on uncomfortable truths. It would be strange if his own final chapter were comfortable. His exit forces uncomfortable questions about power, journalism, loyalty, and the future of trusted news. It asks whether institutions can still protect independent reporting, or whether even the most respected programs can be reshaped by forces the audience never sees. And as the dust settled around his firing, one thing became clear. CBS may have removed Scott Pelley from 60 Minutes, but it could not remove the questions he left behind. After Scott Pelley was pushed out of CBS, the story did not simply fade away. In fact, the silence around his exit only made people more curious. Viewers had watched enough media scandals to know that when a network uses careful language, there is often a deeper conflict beneath the surface. And in this case, the conflict seemed to touch something much bigger than one correspondent's future. It touched the soul of 60 Minutes itself. For decades, 60 Minutes had been more than a television show. It was a symbol. It represented the idea that journalism could still hold power accountable, even when power was uncomfortable, wealthy, political, or protected. The ticking stopwatch, the sharp interviews, the carefully built investigations, all of it created a brand of authority that few programs could rival. When people saw a 60 Minutes report, they expected substance. They expected pressure. They expected the kind of questions that made public figures shift in their chairs. Scott Pelley had become part of that tradition. He was not the original face of the program, but over time he became one of its defining modern voices. He carried himself with the seriousness of someone who understood the weight of the institution behind him. Every question he asked seemed to come from the belief that journalism was not about pleasing the subject, the audience, or the executives. It was about getting closer to the truth. That belief may have been exactly what made him vulnerable. Because in the modern media world, truth is no longer just reported. It is packaged, framed, debated, attacked, defended, and sometimes distorted before the public ever gets to see it clearly. News organizations now operate in an environment where every story can become a political weapon. Every edit can trigger outrage. Every interview can be accused of bias. Every decision is watched, criticized, and interpreted by millions of people who already believe someone is hiding something. Inside that environment, executives often want control. They want to manage risk. They want to avoid lawsuits. They want to protect the brand. They want to keep powerful relationships from collapsing. They want stories that feel strong, but not so explosive that they create a crisis. And sometimes, that desire for control can collide directly with a reporter's instinct to push harder. Scott Pelley's defenders saw his firing through that lens. To them, he was not a difficult employee. He was a journalist doing what journalists are supposed to do, questioning decisions, protecting standards, and refusing to let a legendary program become something weaker than it had been. They saw him as a man who had reached a point in his career where he had little reason to stay silent. He had already built his legacy. He had already earned his reputation. He did not need to flatter anyone for future promotion. That made his voice dangerous. A younger reporter might worry about career consequences. A mid-level producer might fear being blacklisted. But Scott Pelley had the credibility to speak with authority. He could say what others might whisper. He could challenge leadership in a way that forced people to choose sides. And when a respected veteran becomes the center of an internal fight, the institution often faces a painful decision: listen to him or remove him. CBS chose the second path. But removing Pelley did not remove the concern. It only gave that concern a human face. Suddenly, the debate was no longer abstract. It was no longer just about changes in media or the future of broadcast news. It was about a man people recognized, a man they had trusted, a man who had spent 37 years under the CBS banner and still ended up on the outside. That image was powerful because it suggested that no amount of loyalty could protect someone who challenged the direction of the organization. And for many viewers, that felt deeply unfair. There is something painful about watching a person become too principled for the institution that once celebrated those principles. For years, CBS had benefited from Pelley's image as a serious, uncompromising journalist. His credibility helped the network sell itself as trustworthy. His presence reminded audiences of the CBS news tradition. But when that same seriousness turned inward, when he reportedly criticized the network's own leadership and direction, the trait that once made him valuable may have made him expendable. That is the cruel irony of his story. Institutions often praise courage when it is directed outward. They celebrate reporters who confront politicians, corporations, criminals, and foreign governments. They promote the image of fearless journalism because it strengthens the brand. But when that same courage is directed inside the institution, the reaction can be very different. Suddenly, courage becomes disloyalty. Integrity becomes insubordination. A warning becomes a threat. Scott Pelley seemed to understand that risk. He had been in the business long enough to know how powerful organizations protect themselves. He had reported on enough scandals to know that truth rarely comes out cleanly. It comes out through pressure, denial, leaks, statements, and contradiction. It comes out because someone decides the cost of silence has become too high. And maybe, for Pelley, that moment had arrived. The heartbreaking part is that his exit may have been avoidable. In another version of events, CBS could have treated him as a guardian of the program's legacy. Leadership could have heard his concerns not as resistance, but as a warning from someone who knew the show's identity better than most. They could have used his experience to protect 60 Minutes while still evolving for a new era. Instead, the conflict ended with separation. And once that happened, the public was left to interpret the damage. Some saw a normal corporate dispute. Others saw a respected journalist refusing to bend. Some believed CBS had every right to reshape its programming under new leadership. Others believed the network had made a grave mistake by cutting loose one of the last figures who embodied its older journalistic standards. But nearly everyone understood one thing. The firing had changed the way people looked at CBS. Because trust is not only built by what a network airs. It is also built by how a network treats the people who create its journalism. When a respected correspondent disappears after a clash over standards, viewers do not simply move on. They wonder what standards are being protected and what standards are being abandoned. They wonder whether future reports will carry the same independence. They wonder whether the famous name of 60 Minutes still means what it once meant. That uncertainty became Scott Pelley's final impact on CBS. Even after he was gone, he forced the network to face a question no executive could easily answer. Was CBS still the home of fearless reporting, or had it become another institution more concerned with control than truth? And for a man who built his life on asking difficult questions, perhaps that was the most fitting ending of all. Scott Pelley left CBS under painful circumstances. But he left behind the one thing powerful institutions fear most. A question they cannot silence. In the days after Scott Pelley's exit, the story began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just a media headline. It became a symbol of a much deeper fear spreading through modern journalism. The fear that even the most respected newsrooms were no longer fully controlled by journalists. For decades, the public had been told to trust legacy institutions because they had standards, experience, and history. CBS was one of those institutions. It had survived wars, scandals, political storms, cultural changes, and the rise of countless competitors. Its name carried weight because generations of reporters had worked to make it mean something. But names alone cannot protect trust forever. Trust has to be renewed every day. And when CBS cut ties with Scott Pelley after 37 years, many viewers wondered whether that trust had been damaged from the inside. Pelley's career had always been built on a quiet kind of authority. He was not a man who seemed hungry for spectacle. He did not present himself as a rebel or a television warrior. His strength came from steadiness. That made the final chapter of his CBS career even more striking. When someone known for restraint becomes openly alarmed, people pay attention. He was not shouting for attention. He was warning people. At least, that is how many of his supporters saw it. To them, Pelley's clash with leadership was not about ego. It was not about age. It was not about resisting every form of change. It was about protecting the editorial backbone of a program that had become a national institution. 60 Minutes was not supposed to be treated like just another content brand. It was supposed to be a place where journalism still mattered more than management strategy. That is why the phrase, the DNA of 60 Minutes, felt so powerful. DNA is not decoration. DNA is identity. You can change the lighting, the graphics, the pacing, the promotional strategy, even the faces on screen. But when you change the DNA, you change what something is. And that was the fear. Was CBS modernizing 60 Minutes? Or was it weakening the very qualities that made the program trusted in the first place? That question mattered because viewers had already seen what happened to much of television news. They had seen serious debates turn into shouting matches. They had seen political identity become more important than facts. They had seen ratings reward anger, speed, and emotional manipulation. They had watched the line between journalism and entertainment become thinner every year. For people who still believed in traditional reporting, 60 Minutes was one of the last places that seemed to resist that decline. So when Scott Pelley suggested that something fundamental was changing, the fear was immediate. If 60 Minutes could be transformed behind closed doors, then no institution was safe from the forces reshaping media. And Pelley became the face of that fear. His firing also raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between ownership and journalism. Every major news organization exists within a larger business structure. That reality is not new. But the tension becomes more dangerous when business priorities begin to influence editorial judgment. A newsroom cannot function if every difficult story is filtered through fear. Fear of political backlash, fear of lawsuits, fear of angering executives, fear of losing access, fear of upsetting powerful interests. The best journalists are trained to recognize that fear and push through it. But pushing through fear requires protection. A correspondent can ask hard questions only if the institution stands behind the process. A producer can defend a difficult story only if leadership respects editorial independence. A newsroom can challenge power only if it is not constantly looking over its shoulder at corporate consequences. That is what made Pelley's case so troubling. If his version of events was even partly accurate, then his firing suggested that protection inside CBS had weakened. It suggested that a veteran journalist could raise alarms about standards and still be removed. That possibility alone was enough to shake confidence. Of course, CBS had its own perspective. Networks rarely describe these conflicts the same way employees do. Executives may see a veteran correspondent as resistant to change, difficult to manage, or unwilling to adapt to new leadership. They may believe the future requires fresh voices, different methods, and a new editorial approach. From that perspective, Pelley's departure could be framed as part of a necessary transition. But even if that were true, the optics were devastating. Because Scott Pelley was not just any employee. He was part of the public memory of CBS News. His face belonged to the network's modern history. His reporting had helped give CBS credibility at a time when credibility was harder than ever to maintain. Removing someone like that without a sense of public closure made the network look colder, not stronger. And viewers noticed. They noticed the absence of ceremony. They noticed the careful wording. They noticed the contrast between decades of service and the abruptness of the ending. They noticed that a journalist known for serious reporting was gone after reportedly challenging the direction of a serious news program. In television, what is not said can be as powerful as what is said. The silence around Pelley's exit became part of the story. Every missing explanation created room for speculation. Every controlled statement made people wonder what was being left out. Every attempt to move forward only reminded viewers that a major figure had disappeared under a cloud of unresolved questions. That is why the firing felt less like a conclusion and more like an open wound. For Pelley personally, the pain must have been enormous. Imagine giving 37 years of your life to an institution. Imagine building your identity around its mission. Imagine standing in dangerous places, missing private moments, carrying stories of grief and injustice into living rooms across the country. Then imagine that, near the end of your career, the institution you serve decides there is no longer a place for you. That kind of ending does not simply hurt the ego. It rewrites the meaning of the past. Suddenly, all those years of loyalty are forced through one final question. Did the institution ever value the person or only the usefulness of his credibility? That is a brutal question for any professional. But for a journalist, it cuts even deeper because the work is tied to purpose. People like Pelley do not spend decades chasing difficult stories only for a paycheck. They do it because they believe the public has a right to know. They believe facts can still matter. They believe journalism, at its best, is a form of public service. To feel that mission slipping inside your own newsroom must be devastating. And yet, there is something powerful about the way Pelley's story continued after his firing. CBS may have ended his role, but it could not end the conversation he started. His removal forced viewers to examine the machinery behind the news. It forced them to think about who controls the stories they see, who challenges those decisions, and what happens to the people who refuse to stay quiet. That may be the legacy of this painful chapter. Not simply that Scott Pelley was fired, but that his firing exposed how fragile journalistic independence can become when power enters the newsroom. And for 60 Minutes, a program built on exposing hidden truths, that irony was impossible to ignore. For Scott Pelley, the end of his CBS career was not just the end of a job. It was the end of a relationship with an institution that had shaped his life for nearly 4 decades. That is what made the story feel so human beneath all the media analysis. Behind the headlines, statements, and speculation was a man who had spent most of his adult life believing in the mission of a newsroom, only to find himself standing outside of it. That kind of break is never simple. When someone works for one place for 37 years, the organization becomes more than an employer. It becomes part of their identity. The hallways hold memories. The studios hold pressure, triumph, exhaustion, and fear. The colleagues become witnesses to the best and worst moments of a career. Every major story carries a personal cost that viewers never see. And Scott Pelley had carried many stories. He had reported on war, violence, political power, national grief, and human suffering. He had sat across from people who had lost everything. He had asked questions in moments where one wrong word could change the tone of history. He had delivered news to Americans during periods when the country felt divided, uncertain, and afraid. Over time, that kind of work changes a person. A journalist who spends decades facing tragedy learns that truth is rarely clean. It is often painful, resisted, and inconvenient. It does not always arrive with perfect evidence or dramatic confession. Sometimes it appears through contradiction. Sometimes it appears through silence. Sometimes it appears through the nervous behavior of people who do not want a question answered. That experience may be why Pelley seemed unwilling to accept easy explanations inside his own network. He had seen enough institutions from the outside to understand how they defend themselves. He knew that powerful organizations often speak in polished phrases when the reality underneath is far messier. So when CBS described the end of his career in careful language, viewers who trusted Pelley could not help but wonder what had been left unsaid. The tragedy was that Pelley's greatest professional strength, his instinct to question power, may have become unbearable when that power was inside CBS. That is a painful truth about institutions. They often admire courage when it serves them. They promote it, advertise it, and build their identity around it. A news network wants its correspondents to look fearless when they confront government officials, corporate executives, criminals, and public figures. Fearless journalism is good branding. It tells the audience, we are independent. We are tough. We are not afraid. But the real test comes when the fearless questions turn inward. When the journalist asks whether his own newsroom is losing its standards. When he challenges new leadership. When he warns that a legendary program is being reshaped in dangerous ways. When he refuses to pretend that everything is fine. That is when courage stops being useful to the institution and starts becoming a threat. This is why Scott Pelley's story resonated so deeply. It exposed a contradiction at the heart of modern media. News organizations ask the public to trust them as watchdogs of power, but they are also powerful institutions themselves. They have owners, executives, internal politics, financial pressures, reputational concerns, and strategic agendas. They are not immune to the same forces they investigate. And when a newsroom becomes the subject of its own uncomfortable story, the response can reveal more than any official statement. In Pelley's case, many people felt the response revealed coldness. A veteran journalist was gone. The public did not receive a full emotional farewell. The network did not appear eager to turn his departure into a celebration of decades of work. Instead, the story became surrounded by tension and unanswered questions. That absence of warmth mattered. Viewers are not naive. They understand that television is a business. They know that people leave jobs. They know that networks evolve. But they also understand dignity. After 37 years, dignity matters. A person who gave that much time to one institution is not just a replaceable name on a staffing chart. He is part of the institution's story. And when that person is removed abruptly, the institution tells a story about itself. CBS may have wanted the public to see the decision as a clean break. But for many viewers, it looked like something else. The quiet removal of a man who had become inconvenient. Whether that perception was fully fair or not, it became part of the damage. In public life, perception can harden into legacy. For Pelley, however, the ending may have carried a different meaning. Losing CBS was painful, but it also freed him from the constraints of the institution. For decades, his voice had been tied to the network's platform, its rules, its decisions, and its internal politics. Once he was pushed out, the public could hear his criticism in a different way. He was no longer speaking as a CBS employee trying to protect his position. He was speaking as a veteran journalist looking back at what he believed had gone wrong. That gave his words more force. And it made his firing more dangerous for CBS than perhaps the network expected. Because the story did not end with his exit. It became a question of credibility. Every future episode of 60 Minutes would now exist under the shadow of the controversy. Every major editorial choice could be viewed through the lens of what Pelley had warned about. Every change in tone, topic, or personnel could invite viewers to ask whether the program was evolving or losing itself. That is the risk of removing a symbolic figure. You may solve an internal problem, but you create an external symbol, and symbols are difficult to control. Scott Pelley became a symbol of the old guard, of journalistic independence, of resistance to corporate pressure, and of the painful cost of speaking up. Whether people agreed with him completely or not, his story gave shape to a fear many already carried, that traditional journalism was being hollowed out from within, not destroyed all at once, but slowly reshaped by people who valued control more than truth. That fear is powerful because it feels plausible. It does not require a dramatic conspiracy. It only requires 1,000 small compromises. A word softened here, a question removed there, a story delayed, a segment reframed, a reporter overruled, a source protected, a powerful person spared embarrassment. Over time, the audience may still see a familiar logo, a familiar studio, and a familiar program name. But something essential may have changed. That was the warning people heard in Pelley's departure. Not that CBS had collapsed overnight. Not that 60 Minutes had suddenly lost all meaning. But that even the strongest journalistic institutions can be weakened when their internal guardians are pushed aside. And Scott Pelley, after 37 years, had become one of those guardians. His firing was brutal because it suggested that guardians can be removed, traditions can be rewritten, standards can become negotiable, and loyalty, no matter how long or sincere, may not survive a clash with power. That is why the story still feels unfinished. CBS moved forward. The cameras kept rolling. 60 Minutes continued. The network remained standing. But something had changed in the minds of viewers who saw Pelley's exit as more than a personnel decision. They no longer watched only the stories being reported. They watched the institution reporting them. And they wondered whether the man CBS removed had been trying to tell them something before it was too late.